Hello everyone, welcome to this video. In this video I'd like to talk to you about why Warren Buffett, one of the world's most successful people, one of the world's most wealthiest people, dumped his stocks of airline companies. This got a lot of exposure in lots of media outlets, but the story behind it is not as simple as it might seem, and for this we need to understand two things. First of all, we need to understand the aviation industry, aviation sector, and the current state in which it is currently in. And after that, we also need to understand Warren Buffett as a person, so his investor profile. So without further ado, let's first look at the industry, and after that let's have a short talk about what type of an investor Warren Buffett is. So if we think about the airline industry, then, as we also talked about briefly in previous videos, it has been massively affected by the coronavirus or by the COVID-19 outbreak, and particularly in two ways. One, current demand for products and services in the industry, and secondly, the expected demand. So what do I mean by this? So if we think about the effects of coronavirus or of the COVID-19 outbreak, we see that countries, municipalities have restricted the movement of people, sometimes through shutdowns, sometimes through curfews, and sometimes simply through locking the borders. And all of this, of course, affects people being able to get into a plane, and of course then after that plane being able to fly. Sometimes only national flights have been allowed and international flights have been prevented, and sometimes even in many countries national flights also have not been able to help. And this of course results into a massive decrease in activity in airline companies. On top of this, our psychological point of view on flying, of course, also have massively been affected by this outbreak. We already had to trust airline companies beforehand, that they would take us safely and in a good way from A to B, because you don't know whether the plane was checked in a proper way, whether the maintenance has been carried out sufficiently, whether the pilot is up to date, whether all sorts of things we already didn't know when we were making use of airline companies' services, and that makes actually that the airline industry is one that's completely based on trust. Now, on top of this, with the coronavirus outbreak, we also don't know whether we are able to get in a healthy way from A to B, because this time we don't know whether our fellow passengers are sick or not, whether the pilot is sick or not, whether the airline company has done the proper investments to make sure that there's a healthy climate inside of the closed space that an airline gives you when you want to go from A to B. And so regulations and the psychological aspect of the coronavirus outbreak has made that demand has very sharply decreased, and this has of course brought a lot of airline companies in big trouble. And it's not only current demand but also expected demand that has severely been harmed, because regulations are only slowly being reversed because countries don't trust each other and want to prevent a second wave of this outbreak. On top of that, our psychological state is only slowly getting back to what it used to be. It already took a long time for mankind to trust planes because they were flying and because of gravity concerns, of course, and we were always afraid of our lives before entering the planes. Years have been needed for us to trust planes from getting us safely from A to B, and most likely this is now going to recur, and we're again going to see only a slow shift in our mental approach to planes, and only slowly are we again going to be convinced that flying is safe again, as safe at least as it used to be. So this demand decrease, what does it lead to? It leads to an income decrease, right? And this income decrease is of course life-threatening to airline companies, because if this income decrease is not able to be offset by an even further cost decrease by these airline companies, then this is going to hurt their profitability. And actually, a lot of airline companies have not been able to decrease their costs more than their income was hit by these demand decreases. So let's think about it. So the industry is very capital intensive. Planes are expensive. The maintenance of planes are expensive. Slots at airports are expensive. The whole crew around getting planes to fly is expensive. And because flying is also something that's polluting, also the taxes alongside flying are not cheap. So all of these things together make that there are already a lot of costs involved with flying. So you can, of course, sell your planes, you can fire people, but because you're also anticipating on the fact that the virus at some point is going to fade away and hopefully completely disappear, you need to have the capacity to be able to meet the demand increase that might come after the virus. So you don't want to sell too many planes, you don't want to fire too many people because you're still in a competitive mode, right? And this prevents the amount of costs actually that you're able to cut. Also keeping in mind that a lot of countries have actually forbidden airline companies to, for example, fire people because they would like to keep the economy up to date. So costs, because of the desire to preserve capacity, are only limitedly reducible. And on top of this, because you're competing, you're actually also not able to play with your price that much. In the sense that, if you're going to increase your price and if your competitors don't do this, this makes, of course, you less interesting. This is going to hurt your competitiveness. If you're going to decrease your price, demand might not offset the price decrease. And so if you're going to have less demand increase than you're decreasing your price, again, this is going to hurt your profitability. Surely you can also do marketing, but again, is marketing going to lead to higher profits? Yes or no? We don't know. On top of all of this, you also, because you want to get people's psychological state back to where it used to be, you also are going to do some investments in, for example, air circulation, in, for example, your settings on the airport to make sure that people are trusting on the fact that you're going to get them in a healthy manner from A to B. All of these costs are, of course, also accumulate and have to be done now in terms of investments. And this is going to, again, further decrease profitability. So what we see is a situation in which airline companies actually are not that interesting for investors in the short term because of all the increasing costs or the costs that need to be maintained, alongside the fact that income has sharply decreased. And many airline companies actually in this situation have either gone bankrupt or have been bailed out by governments, such as Lufthansa only recently, in exchange for an ownership handoff to the government. And again, this is also not very interesting for the investor because investors often don't want government, don't want public authorities to meddle with the affairs of private companies because often the shareholders' interests don't meet with the government's one. A government might have broader interests, whereas the investor oftentimes only wants profits, as we talked about in the Black Lives Matter video. If you haven't checked it, please check it out should you wish to understand why investors are mainly profit-seeking. So having said all of this, let's get back to Warren Buffett and let's try to understand him and why he made his choice to pull out of the airline industry in terms of his investments. So some quotes, I think, are the best way to define how he is as a person. So let's think about it. Warren Buffett says that we simply attempt to be fearful when others are greedy and to be greedy when others are fearful. So we are in a situation where the stock market is only increasing. We would say on average. And this is crazy if you look at how the economies have got severe hits and how many companies also have gotten severe hits. So in this situation where many are actually greedy and just looking at investing more and more without actually thinking about the real situation of the economy, Warren Buffett in this situation has decided to be more fearful and to be more cautious and actually seek opportunities rather than looking at the past and just sticking to the past. Secondly, what Warren Buffett says is that it's only when the tide goes out that you discover who has been swimming naked. And again, this comes on top of the previous quote, being that only when the market is going to correct itself and when the market is going to show what the real value is of these companies that have been massively hit by the economy, only then we're going to see whether we made a good choice or not. But he, of course, prefers to not be seen swimming naked, and so he decided to move out before the tide hit Third quote, risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. And this, of course, situation wherein we're not knowing how long this coronavirus outbreak is going to last, what the repercussions are going to be for companies, not only in the short term, but also in the mid to long run. And if you think about Warren Buffett, in his next quote, he's saying our favorite holding period is forever. He's a long-term investor, right? He seeks to be partners, he seeks to have influence, and he seeks to not have 5 to 10% growth in only a week time or so, but more like 100, 200, 300% growth over the course of perhaps 5 to 10 years. And this philosophy of him makes that he could better pull out of the airline industry now, even though it might still increase for 5 to 10% or so, and invest actually that money in different companies, for example, tech companies that with much less costs are able to accrue much more income and actually are much more resilient in these situations of coronavirus outbreak, because they are operating through digital platforms and are not as dependent as airline companies on the physical movement from people from A to B. So because of opportunity costs, being that Warren Buffett is not able to spend the same dollar twice, he sought after the best investment of his $1, and he decided that that dollar would best to be not spent on the airline industry in at least the mid to long run, and that he would be able to accrue bigger benefits or at least less costs by pulling out of the airline industry, and that money allocating to some other investment that might be able to come back to him more. I hope this clarifies why Warren Buffett pulled out of the airline industry. It is both his investor profile as well as the sad truth about the airline industry. It's not a good time for the industry. They have had massive hits, and most likely more is to come, even if we don't have a second wave. This first wave is going to have effects that are very long lasting in terms of regulations and countries trusting each other, and in terms of us as people trusting the airline industry once again. And this makes that many investors, among which Warren Buffett, one of the world's richest, wealthiest, and most successful investors, has decided to pull out of the airline industry. I wish you all well. Thank you for your interest. Stay safe. Should you be interested in this channel, in these videos, please hit the like button, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you again soon in the future. All the best.